Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Troublesome Tales, Volume 1, Story 1. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my brother, sister, mother, and I lived in an old house in Umatilla, Florida, north of Eustis. The house was the old traditional wood frame style of the mid to late 1800s, complete with gabled roof and corresponding upstairs ceilings. My father was away on one of his extended ventures that lasted from a month to several, somewhere that didn't afford the likes of food, clothing, and rent money for a starving wife and children. I think the house was donated by people that cared for us more than my father. In any case, we had little more than wire spring mattress frames to sleep on and did well to eat ripe oranges from the orange groves that once covered the area. It must have been early in the season for fruit, for I remembered eating some oranges and tangerines that were still a little green. I mention these details not for pity, but to set the stage of our living conditions at that time. When evening came, we would all huddle together in the living room that was downstairs near the rear of the house. Connected to the rear of the living room was the kitchen, and there was the door to the back porch. I was young, but still remember my mother and others talking about that back door, which had several sturdy locks. Beyond the door was the back porch that went down the width of the back of the house, then continued on the side of the house towards the front. The porch was constructed of wood boards, as was the rest of the house, so when someone walked down the porch you had no trouble hearing it all through the kitchen and living room. If the reason for all those locks on the back door wasn't evident when we first moved in, it became crystal clear a short time thereafter, for every evening, just after sundown, what sounded like a man with cowboy boots could be heard walking down that porch on the side of the house, then turning and continuing to the back door. The knob would then actually turn several times before the visitor left. This went on almost every evening. One day my oldest brother David, who was about 15 at the time, borrowed a .22 rifle and climbed into the huge old oak tree in the backyard. When the time came, we could all hear the footsteps walking down the porch and see the knob turning, but my brother, who had an excellent view of the situation, saw nothing or no one on the porch. After that, we all made sure to be inside before evening and waited out the time for the visitor cowboy to come and go. Many years passed. My brother, sister, and I decided to go back to that house, if it was still there, and see what became of it. We made a trip to Florida, for we all lived in Alabama now, and returned to that home site. We found that the old house was still there, but was now completely surrounded by a fence that was 8 feet tall and full of trees and bushes. It was quite evident that the owners wanted their privacy. We called out and blew the horn until finally a woman came to the gate. She was hesitant to talk at all, especially concerning something in the nature of a paranormal thing, but finally she dropped her defenses enough to talk more openly. She said there had never been any disturbance at the back door, but that strange thing happened on a regular basis in their kitchen. When we finally got her to reveal more about the layout of her home, it became evident that they had renovated the home years earlier, and it was the back door for us was now her kitchen. As it turned out, the old cowboy had finally gotten in and was now making himself at home in the kitchen. True story. Story number 2. My wife and I moved into a house built in 1969 in Phoenix, Arizona. The original owner and her daughter both died while living there. Not necessarily in the house, but while they were residents. For the first 3 years, we never really noticed anything but shadows passing, doorway type of things. We had never acknowledged it to each other at the time. Most were noticed by me, while sitting on the toilet at the end of the hall. The door was on the end hall wall. When no one was home, I rarely closed the door, while reading and doing my business. I would notice a shadow pass across the doorway, like it was going into my bedroom. I was really bothered, 'cause there always seemed like it was low, like a cat or a dog. Checked quite a few times to see if my cat had gone in, and always found my cat outside. No biggie. In 2004, we had twins, a boy and a girl. Around the end of the first year, we would notice that the babies, while sitting in their high chairs being fed, would look into the family room, leaning to either side to see past whoever was feeding them, and point, laugh, and giggle between themselves at whatever they were seeing. something or someone which no one ever saw. During that time, I'd gone out of town. Previous to that was my wife's birthday. We got her a German chocolate cake, which, due to health reasons, she had to wait to eat. There was one piece left when I went away. It had been one of those snap-on plastic lids the store-bought cakes come in. She had debated eating the cake one afternoon and went as far as going to it with the intent of eating it. Due to her Crohn's, she decided to wait till the next day. Going back to it the following day after putting the babies in their cribs, she went to remove the lid and noticed that the icing, her favorite part, had been scraped off the top of the cake. It had been there the day before intact, and the babies were still not walking, and no one had visited from one day to the next. About 2 months later, my sister was babysitting for us. I was feeding the twins in their chairs while talking to my wife, who had called to check in. My sister had gone to the sink to get a washcloth wet with warm water to wash one of the kids. She walked back, washed the first kid off, and turned to walk back to the sink, and she just stopped talking. My wife asked what was wrong, and my sister said the cupboard under the sink was wide open on the right side. My wife handed me the phone. My sister told me what happened. I told her maybe the cat had gotten in the cupboard and she scared it out, but I knew better. She closed it, making sure that the child latch was caught, and went to wash the other kid's face off. When she turned around, the cabinet door was wide open again. She took the kids to my mom's for the rest of the weekend. We had a lot of shadow sightings, bumps in other rooms, things not where we'd left them kind of things happened for the next 9 years. Last week I was in the bathroom at the end of the hall. I was getting ready to go out and my toothbrush was in the kitchen. I was talking to my girlfriend. Yeah, been divorced 2 years. So I got to my toothbrush and went back to the hall bath only to find the cabinet door under the sink wide open, in spite of the childproof latches. We called her Barb, as that was the name of the lady who lived there. Never been overly mean. More of a just getting us to know she's still there kind of thing. One thing I noticed recently again is that I and my youngest daughter always seem to wake up between 3:10 and 3:17 on most nights, and I'm not sure what that means. Next story. I grew up in a house in an area described as rural residential. It wasn't a subdivision, but there were plenty of houses in the neighborhood. Best of all, there were about 14 other boys in the neighborhood, all about the same age as me and my brother. Suffice to say that it was a great place to grow up during the early 1970s. Anyway, nothing strange happened there when I was young, but when I was in my late teens, my parents started talking about the little girl that they'd seen going from room to room. She would come out of one room, go down the hall, and into another room. I blew this off as my parents were getting older now and maybe just seeing things. On Christmas Eve, my brother and his family were there, and he heard his 3-year-old daughter talking in the bedroom. He went in and asked her who she was talking to, and she said, "My little friend." When he asked her where their little friend was, she said, "She went into the bookcase." This kind of freaked my brother out a bit. Later that evening, my parents and my brother and his wife were in the kitchen talking after my niece had gone to bed. They were getting ready to set up Santa Claus when my brother thought he saw his daughter peeking around the door into the kitchen. When he turned around to shoo her back to bed, he realized that it wasn't his daughter, but the little girl that my parents had been seeing. He described her to a T. About 6 or 7 years old, with light brown hair that came straight down and covered one eye. She wore what looked like a white nightgown of some kind, and oh yes, she faded out at about mid-thigh. When he looked at her, she looked up at him and then turned and went down the hall and disappeared. Weird thing about this is that my sisters were the only girls to have lived in that house. My parents had bought it from the builder, and he didn't have any kids, so she couldn't have lived or died in that house. There was no logical reason for that little girl to have been there. She never did anything like move stuff around or make noise. She just went from room to room. Several other people have seen her, my cousin and my ex included. I myself never saw her. My parents moved out of that house 20-odd years ago, and I wondered where that little girl is now. I drove past the house a few months ago. It was vacant, so I stopped to check it out. According to the placards on the front door, the house had been abandoned since 2011. Apparently, some company had winterized the house for the mortgage company and had been locked down since then. When I looked in the front window, a million wonderful memories came back to me, stuff that I haven't thought about in years. I also noticed that the louvered door to the furnace closet at the end of the hall was closed. That was the spot my brother had seen the little girl 3 decades ago. I almost expected to see her come down the hall and into sight, but she didn't. About a week later, I was in that neighborhood again and stopped by. When I looked in the front window, I could see that the louvered door to the furnace closet was now open. Next story. A couple of years ago, the house my sister was living in became something of a problem. They would hear footsteps from the floor above when they knew that no one was up there. They would see shadowy forms out of the corner of their eyes, and they would constantly have the strong feeling of dread, no matter what room of the house they were in. This creepy feeling actually increased over time as the happenings became much more frequent and much more ominous. Ghostly knocking and voices became the norm. Literally, it was a daily occurrence. The shadows became more defined and would literally sit in dark corners and watch a room's occupants for extended periods of time. They began to avoid parts of the house where activity seemed to pick up in intensity when they were in it. Then there were two very strange and terrifying occurrences that really shook things up. The first happened to my brother one night when he went to stay. He decided to sleep on their couch instead of a guest room since the living room had become something of a hotspot in recent times. He awoke suddenly in the middle of the night and became aware of a black figure in the room that was darker than the night around it. It paced the room soundlessly for a short period of time, then it seemed to crawl up a wall and melt into the ceiling above. The area, when he examined it in the morning, was approximately where our sister's room was, one floor above. The second happened a few weeks later. My sister was asleep in her bed when she felt the mattress shift and sink as if someone had sat down beside her. She sat up and began to say the Lord's Prayer while she reached for a small bottle of holy water she had purchased. She daubed the four corners of the bed and commanded the spirit to leave her in peace. What happened next terrified her so much she called both my brother and I in the middle of the night. As she commanded the spirit to depart, she suddenly heard a growl that chilled her blood. Then the bed began to shake violently while the growling continued. This lasted for about 30 seconds, then ended abruptly. At this point, she turned on the lights, called us frantically, and dressed to leave immediately. She made arrangements to have the house blessed, but it turned out that such things sometimes have to be scheduled several weeks in advance, much to my surprise. During the waiting period, a local ghost hunting group heard about the house and asked to do an investigation. Seeing as how she didn't have any other means of addressing the problem, she agreed. The group did a 6-hour walkthrough investigation, followed by another 6 where the recorders and cameras were left to run in the empty house. While they caught nothing on video and still cameras, the audio was described to me as one of the most chilling 12 hours of audio they'd ever experienced. They tallied no fewer than 5 different voices speaking during the entire length, the majority being female. There was a lot of unknown noises that they couldn't figure out the source, mainly in the vein of things being moved or bangs and crashes. The final voice was what they pegged as male, but even the lead investigator said he had never heard such a deep and terrifying male voice. While some of the female voices could be understood, the male voice was unintelligible and consisted of raspy words and growls. The final nail in the proverbial coffin on the audio occurred during the part where no one was in the house. At some time around 4 a.m. in the morning, madness seemed to have broken out in the place. For a stretch of about 10 minutes, 2 separate audio recorders captured what I will describe as a temper tantrum. The stretch began with the voices talking to each other in an agitated state. Then you hear loud footsteps going up the stairs, followed by a series of booms and crashes, as if someone was taking the house apart looking for something. Then it goes quiet for a moment. Then the female voices begin to murmur to each other. Suddenly there is a large explosion of sound as whatever went up the stairs comes back down even louder than before. The female voices totally cease, and a very distinct growling can be heard. Then there's a very loud crash, which seemed to have been the table where the recorder was placed, since you can hear the recorder bouncing on the wood. Then the sequence ends with the basement door being opened violently and what sounds like something scuttling down the stairs. Not human footsteps, but something going on more than 2 legs. Then everything stopped and the house is silent until the team returned and turned off the equipment. Needless to say, my sister went to her church and told them about this. The house cleansing was done within days. Long story short, they had to do it twice, as the priest said he still felt the presence fighting back as he was blessing the house during round 1. The second time seemed effective and the house was quiet for a couple of months. Then the process began again. This time my sister opted to move out instead of going through the whole thing again. She also suspected that a roommate might have been dabbling in something dark and might have been actively calling it back. Next story. Many years ago, my wife worked in a nursing home. One night, she gives me a call. When I get there and soon after I see 2 other guys, one I know to be a husband and one a boyfriend of the other nurses, also confused, also summoned. I know these guys casually, frequently are wives, and the one guy's girlfriend worked together and got off at the same time. They were the sort of women men will drive in the evening to meet coming out of work. On Fridays, they went retro. Someone found some old-fashioned, sexy white nursing outfits somewhere, and they used to come out together, side by side, beaming, hats on, white stockings, white dresses, long leg, one blonde, on strawberry blonde, one platinum blonde. The male patients went nuts on Fridays. Here's what happened. In one room, there was an elderly lady who was immobile. She filled her hours watching activity and reporting things. This is her thing, and she's so accurate, she's a reliable snitch. She goes apeshit one night, saying a man in a brown cloak came down the hallway from the second fire exit that gives off an alarm and went into a room across the hall. Yes, a brown cloak. The nurses ran in there. They don't find any man there, but they found the patient there, another elderly woman that had passed, and she had this terrified expression frozen on her face. It's highly possible she might pass, but that expression in the report concerned everyone. This set everything off. Security's flying around, paramedics, administrators, the cops, everything. We arrived when the cops are still on the perimeter and sweeping the building with security. There was a nurse at the nurses' station facing that hallway. Two nurses were doing meds, one on each side of the hall, and any visitor who somehow managed to get through the door went past them likely when they were in their rooms, if there was anything. So we're standing outside wondering what the heck is going on based on what we heard. Then one of us cracks a comment about the guy being in brown, so it must be UPS, and we shake our head. UPS delivers everything. Nothing was found. So I guess those guys like I chided their wives and forgot about it. I haven't thought about it much. This is like 30 years ago. I thought it was just one crazy lady maybe hearing someone's death prattle and having her imagination run wild. Then I've read about people seeing a man in a cloak, about going into nursing home rooms, hospital rooms, and then shortly thereafter, whoever was there passes away. And I'm getting chills now from something that happened 3 decades ago. Next story. First, an old one. A French-Canadian trapper who lived alone was found frantically running around, looking terrified, with torn-up feet and wearing dirty long underwear, miles from his cabin one day, and asked how he, known to be such a tough, solitary man, could wind up in such a state. He took a few swigs of whatever was very strong, and then said that he was alone in the cabin, laying on his bed in the pitch black when he thought he heard something moving around. Being practical and incapable of abstract thought, he reached for his matches on the shelf. When they were handed to him, he left without looking back. I always felt the second most terrifying second would be for whoever was the first person to go to the cabin and stick his head in to make sure it was clear. One of the most interesting things I've observed when I was working in an old creepy building is that we had two guys, both retired Air Force. One was a big friendly guy, great sense of humor. The other was a surly, unimaginative man who lived in the here and now and swore he'd never leave the place for another job. They scoffed at and ridiculed those who said they saw things that shouldn't be in the building. That happened several times over the years. One night, while the unimaginative one did rounds alone, something happened. He came rushing back. He looked at everyone else, quizzically then accusingly, but didn't say anything about what left him in such a state. He put in paperwork for another work location the next day. He would leave the area or shut down conversation when anyone asked about what happened. The big, burly, boisterous, and friendly guy used to joke that if he ever saw something, we'd know because we'd see a puddle of pee next to his radio and keys, and we'd find a hole his shape going through the nearest wall like a cartoon escape. One night, when some inexplicable thing happened, he came back and was quiet the rest of the night. He was a friendly guy, and he became really quiet until he left, and he never contacted us again. Very skeptical, but I do discuss things, and I'm curious and ask lots of questions. Some other people did tell me what they saw, and I've wondered if what those two saw was the same sort of things the others saw, but spoke of more freely. But then again, I guess I'll just never know. Next story. In high school, I worked concession for a sports venue. There wasn't a lot of room behind the counter, and when it got busy, we'd constantly bump into each other. Sorry, excuse me, sorry about that. Sometimes, when I was working alone, I'd bump into someone and apologize, then realize that there was no one there. A couple of the other guys said the same thing happened to them. We'd bump against something solid, but when we turned around, there'd be nothing there. At the end of the day, one of the chores was to straighten up the storeroom, which got pretty disheveled over the course of a busy day. I would straighten that room, walk out, and lock the door. Forget something and unlock it and go back inside, and the shelves would be in disarray again. Only one door in and out, no windows. That used to make my hair stand on end. When we were ready to leave, we'd lock up all the display cases and gave the key to the manager. He was a no-nonsense kind of middle-aged guy. We all left at the same time, and when we returned the next day, the display cases would be messed up, but still be locked. The storage room had one of those industrial-sized sinks in it. Darn if that thing didn't turn on full blast by itself. Once when I was looking right at it, you could hear it from the concession counter, too. Not just little drip, but all the way on as far as it would go. Someone would go back and turn it off, and as soon as they got back to the counter, you'd hear it come on again. I only worked there one summer. There was a cemetery adjacent to the venue, so of course that contributed to the creepiness factor, and there were rumors that the cemetery once extended to the buildings of the venue, but I'm pretty sure that was just kids making stuff up. Those were still some persistently creepy experiences, though, which I've never forgotten. Next story. In 1975, two of my brothers and I dug into an American Indian mound. By pure chance, we dug into the grave of a young boy or girl, around 7 to 10 years old by stature. Most of the smaller bones had deteriorated, but the skull, hip bones, some of the spine, etc. was still intact, so we took those. The material that was his or her clothing was still recognizable, but would disintegrate on touch. The small weave of the cloth was much finer and more sophisticated than what I'd imagined possible from that time period. He, I think it was a boy, had two clay pots of what appeared to be food, at one time grasped in his right arm and hand. The pots still had little painted designs going around the middle of the pots. The tops had formed a crust, but when that crust was opened, there was only charcoal inside. So that's why I think it was food. There were also shell beads all around the neck, so this must have been the child of someone important or high rank, a chief's son. It took all day to dig and then carefully remove the remains and take it all back home. It was late, so we all decided to leave it at my house until the next day, or until we decided what to do with everything. I placed everything neatly on shelves in the hall, just outside my bedroom. I was tired, so after a much-needed shower, I was ready for sleep. But just as I began to slide into oblivion, I rose fully awake when an electrical entity moved from the hall, where the remains were, into my bedroom and stood directly above me. I use the term electrical because it gave off a bluish glow and a 60-cycle hum. The absolute power emanating from this thing was incredible. Above all of this, I could tell that it was highly dissatisfied that I'd taken those remains from its resting place. I felt that the entity was the father of the boy, but for all I know, it could have been the child's spirit itself. I jumped up, got my clothes on, and got over to where my brothers were living. They first laughed at me when I told them what had happened, but a couple of hours with the remains was all it took to convince them as well. We gave everything to a local collector who cherished it, with or without the curse. I had collected arrowheads, flint projectile points, and artifacts all of my life, but got rid of everything after that. I'm 1/4 American Indian, so I do believe all the things my father told me and his father told him, but I think even then an Irishman would have been visited that night. Next story. Used to say people that spoke of ghosts, etc., were 1 or 2 brain cells light, but that was before an evening at the old fire station, one of many nights I spent there. This place was notorious for stories of haunting and ghostly encounters, though I really didn't believe the stories, feeling they were made up to cause a fright for the younger fire and rescue personnel. One evening we were doing the standard late-night thing at the station. 4 of us were laying in our bunks watching TV and swapping stories. It was about 12 or so when we heard the front entrance doorway open and close. This was a large steel door, and all the department members had a key, so there was nothing strange about that, and our conversation continued. Soon after the front door had shut, we heard 2 females, one of which was trying to calm the other one down, and the second crying hysterically. We heard them walk past the bunk room door, heard them into the ladies' restroom. That door shut, and the fan in the restroom came on, which it automatically did when the light was switched on. Kidding back and forth, one of the firemen stated, "One of the rescue women must have got her heart broken or something." We all chuckled a bit and continued our conversation. Next thing we know, one of the women starts screaming. The worst scream I've personally ever heard. a scream of true fear and pain. We all sprung from our beds, throwing our bunker pants on as we hit the hallway on our way to the ladies' restroom. As we approached the door, we could hear the crying and calming voice, and I vividly remember seeing the light under the bathroom door and the fan going on in the bathroom. One of the other guys knocked loudly on the door. Both the crying and calming voices immediately stopped, and the toilet flushed. Bill knocked on the door again and no reply, perfectly quiet. Bill opened the door, the bathroom light was still on, and the toilet was refilling. No one in the bathroom. Keep in mind, the only way out is through the door. No windows, no nothing. Bill's immediate reply was, "This is bullshit." He instructed two of the guys to go through the rec room and told me to come with him. We went out the front door and stood about 10 feet from each other. I was silent, and he kept repeating that this is total BS. Never had I had the feelings and emotions I experienced that night. All of a sudden, we could hear the one woman screaming again, obviously between us. It sounded as though her voice was a million miles away. Seconds later, the other two firefighters arrived round front where we stood. We all went back to bed with little discussion, but rather, I guess, everyone's thoughts kept to themselves about what we'd experienced. I myself laid down on my stomach with my arm under me, which promptly I fell asleep. Did I move my arm out from under me? Heck no, I didn't move a muscle the remainder of that night. That night did forever change my beliefs, and I would never ever question anybody who tells me their ghost story. Next story. My mother's uncle, we called him Uncle Ed, was an old bachelor who drove a battered old pickup full of crap with a topper. He was sort of an amateur tinkerer and always had an old transistor radio with him. He'd wave a fly swatter and say, "Yeah, you betcha," all the time. Yeah, we were in Minnesota. He shot himself one day, and his neighbor found him in his apartment. We all cried. He helped our family out a lot when we were dirt poor, and me and my sisters loved him. Sweet old guy. Tragic life, though. One day, I was at home alone in an old farmhouse out in the country. My mom and sisters were out fishing and not sure where stepdad was. I was reading on the couch in the living room. If I looked up, I could see through the door into the kitchen and out of one of the kitchen windows. I was about 12 or so at the time. Not sure why I looked up when I did, but I looked out that window, and sure as I'm sitting here, my Uncle Ed walked into view outside the window, turned and looked right at me, waved his little wave, and turned and walked on. I ran outside, and of course he wasn't there. I think he just stopped to say goodbye. I miss that old fart. Next story. For the record, I don't drink, don't do drugs, was not on any medication, and I'm definitely saying no mental or emotional problems. A few years ago, I was sitting on the couch in the lounge doing crossword puzzles. I'm a night owl and love the quiet of night. The rest of my family were already in bed fast asleep. My lounge doesn't have doors, and the couch was facing the passageway. The lights were on in the lounge and the passage, and my couch was about 2 or 3 meters from the passage. So I'm doing my puzzle, and suddenly I got the feeling that somebody was watching me. I'm sure you all know that feeling, that you can sense when you're being watched, and I looked up from my crossword puzzle and stared straight into his big, burning, red, round eyes. His eyes were very big and very round and literally glowing, similar than a hot, burning coal, but kind of hypnotic and scary. I sat there rooted on the couch, shocked and staring into his eyes. I couldn't move. Although we didn't speak, when our eyes met, I heard or understood in my head the words, "You're not supposed to see me." He stood there frozen, and I was frozen on the couch. I could see the shock, surprise in his eyes, and kept on hearing that I was not supposed to see him. It was as if he was communicating with me telepathically. I'm saying him, but there was no visible genitals. He was short, probably the size of a 6 or 8-year-old kid. He was naked, pitch black skin, no body hair at all, and no visible genitals. His arms were long in proportion to his body, almost ape-like. His hands and feet were very big in proportion to his body, but I did take in detailed notes on fingers and toes. I just saw these long arms, almost reaching to his calves, very well-defined calves, very short and muscular legs, and a short, broad, muscular torso. He had a very big head, and it was out of proportion to his body. In other words, too big for his body. He had big glowing eyes, and they were round. He had a strong square jaw, high and very well-defined square cheekbones, broad forehead. He had no nose, apart from what looked like two holes or slits, and the mouth was kind of like a long horizontal slit. I didn't notice lips or teeth, and his mouth was closed. Anyway, I don't know for how long we stared at each other in shock. It could have been a few seconds or a few minutes. Time kind of stood still. Then all of a sudden he turned to his right and ran super fast down the passage towards my son's bedroom. I jumped off the couch in hot pursuit and searched my son's room and the other rooms, but he simply vanished into thin air. I have to admit that I was very disappointed that he disappeared like that, as I would have liked to communicate with him despite my feeling of terror when our eyes locked. I've seen other entities during the course of my life, and more so when I was a child, but those were always human in appearance, and often almost ethereal, but this creature was different. He was solid in appearance. I could see his chest move as he breathed, and he was standing in the lit passageway. This was definitely no ghost or spirit entity. Since it's not a ghost or a spirit, perhaps was it a bleed-through from another dimension? Next story. There's a few different things that have gone on in my home, but I'll break them up and get to them. And as a way of reference, I'm 43 years old, 21-year law enforcement veteran, 13 years in the military, and currently a pilot, flight instructor, NVG instructor, and check airman for my agency's aviation unit. No history of ever using any drugs, including marijuana, and no history of mental illness. Not a member of the tinfoil hat brigade, and just an otherwise normal guy. Except, I know for a fact paranormal things exist. All of my occurrences have happened since I moved to Arizona, but I've always been open-minded to such things. The first thing was after my cat died. He and I were buds, and I'd had him for many years, since the very first house after moving here. He died very suddenly and traumatically in February of 2009. I was pretty torn up for a while thereafter and still get screwed up talking about it, so I won't go into detail, but suffice to say it's been tough. Anyway, the night he died, I saw his shadow in the living room, against the wall, walking down the hall, towards me and my wife's bedroom. It was very definitely his shape, and the only other cat we had was a lot smaller and was in the bedroom at the time, so it wouldn't have been her. Then, about a year or two ago, my best friend was over, and again we were hanging out and chatting away in my living room. While we were talking, we both saw at exactly the same time a brightly colored blob shape, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet in size, about 6 feet off the ground, move through the kitchen. It actually interrupted our conversation, and we both stopped and snapped over to it. As soon as we turned to it, it was gone. The best way I can describe it was kind of like static, or if you remember in the old Star Trek of the 70s, the bright sparkly colored shimmer that happens when they use the transporter. That's essentially what it looked like. Multicolored, bright, and glittery, but as soon as we tried to look directly at it, it was gone. So again, he and I just smiled and shook our heads, and he again informed me with that, "Dude, your effing house is haunted." The very last thing happened not so long ago, but it was also the most vivid. My house is a split plan, big and open, room in the middle, master bed on one end, and a spare bed and office on the other end. The garage is attached to the side with the spare bedrooms and office. It's about half tile and half carpet. So one day after work, I'm in the office goofing around in my gun safe when I hear my garage door go up. My wife was on her way home, so it was about time for her to get there. Then the door leading from the garage into the hallway opens and closes, and I hear my wife's high heels clicking loudly, I might add, down the hall and turn and go into the kitchen. She always carries her lunch in a plastic bag like you get at Walmart. I heard the bag rustle and her set it on the counter, then heard her continue walking in her heels across the kitchen. Don't find me afterwards. Well, I was knee deep in my gun safe just messing around, and after a few minutes I hadn't heard from her, so I went to find her. I called her name. No response. Went to the bedroom. Lights were off. Closet? Nope. Not there. Lights off. So I backtracked to the garage thinking maybe she went out to get something in her car. No car. The really eerie thing is the garage door was open. Remember, I said I heard it go up. And I know when I came in from work, I lowered it because I always watch it go down just to make sure. So I called her on the cell phone thinking maybe she slipped out to the store for dinner or something, or had to run a last minute errand. Unlikely, but whatever. Anyway, she answers and she's still 5 minutes away and hasn't been here yet. That one spooked her when I told her after she really got home. It didn't bother me too much, but has made me start to perk up a little more and take note of things. Next story. The house I lived in previous to where I am now had several incidents. I lived alone there for most of the 5 years I was there. I regularly got that being watched feeling, but not as often as the first house I bought when I moved here in 1999. The first house, it was an everyday occurrence. At the new house, it was just once in a while. On many occasions, usually weekend afternoons in the summer, I'd take an afternoon nap and be woken up by either my name being called or by the sound of a bell being rung in my left ear. But always just one ding, never multiples. Never both at the same time, just one or the other. The voice, when it happened, would be female, always the same, and not anyone I know. That got so common I'd wake up, roll my eyes, go back to sleep, and oftentimes it would happen again until I finally got up. Something was trying to get my attention, but I still have no idea why. Twice at night I was at my computer desk, room lights off, browsing the web. You know how your eyes get tired of looking at the screen in the dark after a while? Well, on two occasions, I closed my eyes and just rested a few seconds when that tired feeling came on, and on both occasions, a shadow moved between my face and the screen. I could see the shadow move from left to right across my eyelids, backlit by the bright computer. I immediately opened my eyes and nothing was there. Same scenario at night on the computer, and once during the day, I think. I was sitting there and out of the blue something whispered in my left ear. It was unintelligible what was being said, but it was very definitely words, and very close in my ear. Enough that I jumped back instinctively. That one kind of messed me up a little. It happened a few times though, and when it would happen, the whispering would last maybe 1 to 2 full seconds. Disembodied voices will get your attention. It didn't sound angry or happy, more like it was trying to convey something important in a very short burst. I wish I knew what was said. Within a year of that, I was out of state for an extended time doing some training, and my former partner at work agreed to house sit for me and watch the place while I was gone. He's still my best friend, and he and I are very similar, and both are fairly sensitive to these types of occurrences. He never really had anything like this happen at his house, but we have both had things happen at mine. Anyway, while I was gone, he and his dog, a yellow lab, were over one night and the same thing happened in the computer room. He was sitting there and something whispered in his ear. He sent me an email that night entitled, "Hey Effer, your house is haunted." I kind of had to laugh when I read the email. Anyway, whatever it was, tried to talk to him too, twice if I recall correctly. Up until this point, I never told him about my occurrences, so when it happened to him with no previous knowledge of what I had experienced, that was kind of confirmation for me. Later that same night, when he was watching TV in my family room, his dog, who is normally the happy-go-lucky, always in a super great mood type lab, freaked out for no reason. And knowing this dog for many years, I've never seen him bark or trip out over anything. He just hangs out and likes to be petted. But this night, he went into my formal living room, which was totally empty as I had no furniture from the divorce to put in it. He bristled up and began growling and barking at the top of the ceiling, towards the corner by the front door, tail between his legs, shaking. I've never seen him do that before or since in 11 years. My friend said he went crazy and was obviously scared to death of something up in the corner. This went on for a few minutes, then the dog slinked off. After I got back in town, he and I were hanging out, watching movies, chatting about work and making a few martinis. Let me preface this by saying that I had work this particular day. I got up that morning, made breakfast, went to work, came home, and he came over afterwards. We used to work together and no one else had access to the house during the day. Anyway, he goes into the kitchen to make some food, opens up a drawer by the stove, turns to me and says, dude, why do you have water in your drawers?" So at first I think I've got a busted water line in the house. Nope. It's like this. My kitchen was U-shaped, sink on the left side of the U, stove in the middle part of the U, and fridge on the right side of the U, with bunches of oak cabinets between. Right in the middle of the U next to the stove, I had 3 kitchen drawers on top of each other. A small one at top, medium in the middle, and a big one for pots at the bottom. All three drawers were approximately halfway filled with water. The thing is, there was no source of water above, behind, or around them. The water was totally contained in each drawer and hadn't leaked from one to the other. I pulled them out and inspected them, dry on the bottoms. I looked in the cabinet shelf itself, dry underneath. I looked under the granite countertop, bone dry and actually still dusty from where the installers had put it in years ago. Also, there was no water line in the wall behind the stove, no water on the ground, nothing above the countertop, nothing. Literally, the only place in the kitchen there was any water was within those three drawers. There was no source for it, and even if there was, the drawers were only partially full, so it's not like they overflowed to fill the two underneath. Oh, and remember I mentioned earlier about making breakfast? I was in those drawers earlier in the day, and all were bone dry. I got my utensils for breakfast out of them that morning, and they were perfectly normal. He and I looked at each other and just shook our heads. A second time he was over, hanging out, the front door decided to open itself. It was windy outside, so I can't swear it was anything other than us not closing it fully. But, let's say I have my doubts. Next story. Many years ago, I bought my first house in Garland, Texas. When I moved in, all I had was an army cot and my dog. I quickly furnished the place. Now I tend to move about in the dark in the morning when I get up and at night when I go to bed. In the morning, in order to get to the kitchen, I had to go down the hall. Right turn to the kitchen and left turn to the den. I just gotten a big chair with a separate footrest, the kind of divided the den and the path out of the hall. Not 2 days after setting the chair there, while headed to the kitchen in the morning, I ran into the chair and stubbed a toe. Flipped on the light and the chair was halfway into the pathway from the hall. I pushed it back thinking I bumped into it the night before. I remembered this is a heavy chair. Well, on and off this chair would wind up in the pathway from the hall, and sure enough I'd run into it. The same thing would happen with the footrest. I'd flip the lights off in the den to go to bed, and I'd run into it. In a matter of seconds, it would move several feet. Normally, where it's placed, you wouldn't walk anywhere near it. The very last time was in the morning, and the chair was all the way in the pathway from the hall and wound up falling over it. I got pissed and yelled out something interesting. The words were something like, "Knock that damn shit off." And you know what? It stopped happening. No one has ever died in the house that I'm aware of, but I'm convinced something was messing with me. Now what that who or whatever it is remains unknown. Next story. The land we lived on in New Mexico was heavily traveled by the first settlers in this area. There were lots of deaths along the Rio Grande as the area grew. We had an entity, for lack of a better word, that would actually move things in the house. Whatever or whoever this is moved curtains, items, tables, etc. We had lots of dogs. The dogs in the house would frequently sense something in the house and either chase it or hide from it, depending on the dog. My wife actually saw the figure of a man in dark clothing in the pasture next to our house, standing on a sandy hilltop. She was shaken, so I went out to try to find him. This is a very sandy area and footprints should have been easy to find since no one walks this area. I got to the spot and there were lots of coyote and cow tracks, but no human tracks. We have named him Juan and he visits regularly. Next story. I teach in an older school. It's a public school in Indian land located in a reservation in Northern California. Last school year, in an area adjacent to the school property, it was being excavated to build a new senior citizen center. Pretty old bone fragments were found. The job was shut down for a few days to investigate if the bones were from a recent death or an old burial. It was determined later the bones were at least 70 years old and not in a traditional burial plot. A day after the remains were found, my classroom began to have odd happenings occur in it. I arrived one morning and the early shift janitor was there to ask me, "Have I noticed anything unusual in my room?" "No," I replied. He said, "Well, you need to talk to Glenn." I asked, "Why?" He replied, "Well, something odd has occurred." I put it out of my mind and went about my day. Late that afternoon, Glenn stopped by and asked me if I'd experienced anything weird in the room lately. I told him no. While Glenn is pretty high up in the local native religious/cultural families, he told me that that morning before he had come to turn off the alarm for our wing of the school and he went through the room, he saw a figure walk in front of the window and the lights turned on. We have the Echo Groovy lights that are controlled by motion detectors to turn on or off. The lights are a pain in the butt because if there's no movement, then the light turns off during class time. He said he saw the lights turn on and he thought I'd come into work really early around 6:30. He said he saw what he thought was me passing by the windows, and then the lights came on and he had his keys in the door to turn off the alarm, and then the alarm went off. He said he opened the door and almost crapped himself because I was not in the room. This all happened within 24 hours of the remains being disturbed. Since then, there have been multiple occasions when items in the classroom have been moved from where they were last placed. One morning I found the wall clock in the middle of the room, face down and still running. One day the night janitors decided to punk me, and they placed all the desks stacked into a pyramid. They admitted to doing that prank though. Now, I'm daily looking for my tape dispenser. It has ended up being in the most unlikeliest place. My regular janitor has been on leave for a workplace disability, and the sub-janitor has no knowledge of the past pranks or very real spiritual disturbances. Now, the folks around here are very spirit-minded and don't cotton to entertaining spirits. The general belief is let go of loved ones who have passed on to the Creator. So I will say as I enter the room, do not harm the children and leave us be. Living in Indian country means that one can either entertain the departed or let them be and go on to the Creator. The traditional belief is to mourn for a period and to release folks to go to their rest. Next story. I was in a building in Pennsylvania that a friend had bought, intending to renovate it into a tavern. It was near a famous battlefield. The basics of the building were sound, but it had been poorly kept for the last 30 years. A very cramped door led down to the basement, which was always wet. My friend did everything he could think of short of replacing the foundation to dry it out, but there always seemed to be significant water on the floor. As I was descending the stairs one day, a clear and obvious woman's voice said to me, "Sugar, light your lamp. This place is unclean," in a pure Georgia peach accent. There was no one else in the building. I pulled my little mag light from my purse and continued down, but didn't see anything out of the normal. I never would go down there without lighting something after that, though. Don't know if it ever helped or hindered anything. We found out later that the family that built the building had a mad daughter they kept in the basement nearly her whole life. Later was used as a field hospital for officers during the Civil War battle. This was proven out by archaeologists finding the grave where the amputated body parts were buried. Clearly seen on ground-penetrating radar were dozens of arms and legs with boots still on. Bodies were kept in that basement until burial could be arranged later. Next story. So this happened in 2002 or 2003. I was still active duty Coast Guard, still in the reserves, and I was on watch. I was in a small room at the corner of the building with two big windows that made up the wall in front of me and the wall to my right. The watch consisted of listening to radios and responding to marine traffic such as SAR, aids to navigation issues, and general info. So it's late, like 2300, and I see a guy in a float coat walk past the window in front of me. Didn't recognize him. I lost sight for a split second where the windows meet, and that was it. There was nowhere he could have hidden. He was heading for the dock and just simply wasn't there. Here's the kicker. It's summer in North Carolina, and this guy's wearing a float coat. A blue one. We haven't had blue float coats for a long time. I don't know. It was weird to me. I called the OOD, and he came and looked around, didn't find anything. He was unhappy about being woken up. Next story. As crazy as it sounds, this is all true. I hooked up with a girl I used to know. She lives in an old farmhouse. She said it was haunted. When she bought the place, the lady told her Dad is still here. She didn't realize at the time what she meant. When she started remodeling, things would fly off shelves and fall over. She told me many stories about things that happened to her. I will tell you about the things that happened to me. I moved into the house a little before Christmas. I saw things fall over 3 times for no reason, but the first night I stayed overnight, I woke up to her ghost standing in the room a few feet away looking at us. He wears bib overalls and a red flannel shirt. His face is blurry and has dark spots where his eyes should be. I stared and he stared back. He looked real sad. I fell back asleep after a while. He never moved. The next night, I heard someone call my name once. Then again, I rolled over and said, "What?" thinking it was her husband. Yeah, it's been crazy, but he's basically just a roommate and they're in the process of getting divorced. It wasn't him. I laid back down and he called my name a third time. I asked the ghost what he wanted, but no response. Her roommate lived there 15 years before he saw the ghost standing by the propane tank looking in the window. A couple of days later, someone called and the answering machine picked up. After they left a message, the ghost answered, "Okay. I can't always see him. I'm really creeped out, but stay." She said he likes to sit on the porch. The first time she mentioned it, just matter of fact, Skeet's on the porch. I looked but didn't see anything. She asked, "Is the rocking chair moving?" I looked and it was. I hollered out, "Skeet, are you out there?" The chair rocks harder. I said, "Okay, I'll leave you alone." An hour and a half later, I hear boom, boom, boom as he goes down the steps. I've heard him twice on the porch. If I straighten the chair, he returns it back and angles it a little. A few days back, I see a black oblong form about the size of a cat shoot through the air into the kitchen. Tried telling myself it was a cat. She knew I'd seen something from the look on my face and described what I'd seen. She said the cats play with it all the time. I also see strange lights in the kitchen that disappear into the ceiling. She says it's normal. As crazy as it sounds, the ghost of a horse comes by too. I heard it yesterday morning. Sent chills through my body. Skeet sounds like a normal alive person, but the horse has a chilling sound to it. The horse was run over real close to the house some years back. Things are way creepier than I make them sound, but I'm not good with words and whatnot. My girlfriend's not creeped out at all, and it's not bothered by it. But me, however, that's a different story.